The records are brittle now, pages flake beneath the hand, and what remains of the ink seems less written than burned into the paper. Yet within these fading lines, one encounters not simply a ledger of death, but a testimony to the devotions of a woman whose name survives only in whispers. She was called Margaret Rainsford, born of the Kentucky frontier and hardened by the cruel rhythms of wilderness life. But in the first years of the new century, long before the blight of war divided the nation, her legend began to fester along the dark corridors of Virginia. They knew her not as a widow, nor as a mother, but as a hunter. The quarry was neither animal nor outlaw, but men and women who fled bondage under cover of night. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The year was a restless era when superstition held equal power to law, and the solemn language of Scripture could justify any cruelty if spoken by the right tongue. In the township of Harrogate, beyond the Blue Ridge, Margaret first appeared in the county register. Her arrival seemed innocuous. A woman of 36 years, dressed in black, traveling with a child who bore no clear parentage. They settled in a timber house near the river's edge, where the land turned marshy and the fog lay thick for weeks. But rumors already clung to her. Some claimed she was widowed in childbirth. Others whispered that her husband had died under more violent circumstances, his skull fractured with a tool of her own hand. Whatever the truth, Margaret assumed the role of healer and spiritual counselor, offering tinctures for fever and passages of Scripture for despair. She carried herself with such solemn grace that neighbors, though unsettled, brought her into their confidence. Yet behind her shuttered windows, she was constructing something altogether different, a chamber of doctrine and blood. The first written notice comes from the county physician, Dr. Elias Morton, whose journals form much of what we know. He described Margaret as possessed of a keen intellect, prone to melancholia, and yet enthralled by notions of sacrifice as a necessary medicine to the ills of mankind. He noted the sharpness of her eyes, how they lingered too long upon the bodies of patients, measuring not their health, but their frailty. Morton, cautious though he was, admitted admiration for her resolve. She quoted Latin to him, and spoke of Galen and Paracelsus, as if she had studied under their hand. It was this blending of scripture, pseudo-medicine, and folk ritual that marked her earliest practices. To the township she was a widow with a gift. To the escaped slaves who wandered northward through the valley, she became something monstrous. The Harrogate Gazette of March 1801 records the disappearance of two families traveling toward Pennsylvania. Their wagon was found overturned, provisions scattered, but no bodies were recovered. It was later, much later, that investigators suspected Margaret's involvement. At the time, all they had was silence and the lingering dread that someone was hunting in the woods. Margaret herself gave sermons in her parlor. Survivors described them decades later as half prayer, half indictment, in which she proclaimed the necessity of purity through suffering. Her doctrine was not the salvation of Christ, but the refinement of bloodline. She spoke of contagion in the human stock, of weaknesses passed from generation to generation. She identified these in the trembling hands of a sick child, the dull eyes of a farmhand, the fits of a laborer exhausted by toil. To her, such defects were not afflictions to be cured, but stains to be erased. By summer, whispers in Harrogate grew louder. Some spoke of screams carried across the marsh at night. Others swore they saw Margaret leading her child, lantern in hand, deeper into the fog than any sensible soul would wander. A merchant's wife, returning late from market, claimed she witnessed a figure on the road bound in rope, stumbling behind Margaret like an animal to slaughter. No complaint was filed. Fear ruled more heavily than law. In the autumn of that same year, Dr. Morton noted a shift. Margaret's visits to him ceased. Instead, he was summoned to her home. There he encountered a series of peculiar drawings upon her table, figures of the human form dissected and rearranged, annotated in her tight script. She spoke openly of refining the body through sacrifice, insisting that the blood of the unworthy could preserve the strong. Morton recorded his horror, but he did not denounce her. Her conviction, he wrote, is such that I cannot determine whether she is mad, or whether I am but slow to understand a truth which lies beyond common reason. What we can know, what the record permits, is that by the year's end, the pattern of vanishings intensified. Families bound for the north never arrived. Search parties discovered signs of struggle near the river, but no tracks beyond Margaret's land, and still the township remained silent. She had become more than a neighbor. She was a presence, an unspoken authority. Her voice echoed in their churches, her remedies cured their fevers, and her gaze promised ruin should they question her too closely. It is within this silence that the horror germinates. The story of Margaret Rainsford is not one of a single crime, nor even of many, but of a system of belief that spread through marrow like disease. She cloaked her violence in the garments of scripture and the guise of healing, making her cruelty not only permissible but sacred. Thus the stage was set. In the fog-bound year of 1801, in a township that feared its own shadow, Margaret began her work. What remains is testimony written in fear, sealed by shame, and preserved only because some hands could not bear the weight of silence forever. The winter of 1801 arrived in Harrogate with a grey persistence that seemed almost deliberate. Snow fell in silent sheets, blanketing the timber homes and marshlands in a veneer of stillness that belied the terror stirring beneath. Margaret Rainsford's operations, previously intermittent, now assumed a rhythm both terrifying and methodical. She did not simply stalk her victims, she observed, calculated and manipulated, establishing herself as a predator operating with precision far beyond the capabilities of ordinary men or women. Morton, still uneasy from his earlier encounters, began documenting the anomalies he noticed in local populations. Entire families vanished without warning, leaving livestock and possessions undisturbed. Children who had wandered too close to the edge of the woods returned hours later, frightened, disheveled and strangely silent. Those who survived brief encounters with Margaret's machinations described a woman whose calm, patient demeanor masked a deliberate cruelty, one capable of inspiring terror through suggestion alone. Morton's journal contains a passage that chills the modern reader. She does not chase, she waits, and when she waits, the woods themselves seem to conspire with her. Margaret's methodology was as unusual as it was horrifying. She did not strike in haste. Instead, she cultivated knowledge of her prey, using every observation to her advantage. Escaped slaves traveling northward soon found themselves under a subtle, almost imperceptible surveillance. Footprints in the mud, disturbed brush along forest edges, or a barely audible crack of twigs could signal her presence long before the hunter revealed herself. She combined this with religious symbolism, leaving cryptic passages from scripture at the outskirts of paths used by escaping families. These messages, carefully selected verses, emphasizing obedience, punishment and divine wrath, were intended to erode the psychological resilience of her victim. One incident, later recorded in fragments of local testimony, involved a family of 3 who had fled a tobacco plantation near the James River. Margaret, having identified their hiding place in a swamp, engaged in a campaign of terror that spanned 2 weeks. She left scraps of paper bearing biblical passages along the edges of the swamp trails. The family, exhausted from travel and terror, began interpreting these messages as signs of divine displeasure for their attempted flight. They grew paranoid, refusing to forage or rest for fear of angering God. It is believed that this prolonged psychological torment rendered them incapable of rational thought when Margaret finally made her presence known. Margaret's journals, preserved by Dr. Morton and other careful observers, reveal an almost scholarly understanding of fear and its application. She recorded minute details of the family's routines, cataloging their vulnerabilities with precision: which child was most impressionable, which adult prone to panic, which paths they favored for concealment. The journal entries read less like the notes of a murderer, and more like the work of a tactician or theologian. The mother interprets the inked words as divine wrath. She is pliant. The eldest boy observes the waterline. He is clever but predictable. The daughter, fragile in constitution, will break before the fortnight ends. Her violence was theatrical, a grotesque inversion of sacred ritual. When the murders finally occurred, she arranged the bodies in forms that suggested divine retribution, burning passages of scripture beside the victims, placing symbols of religious faith in positions that implied celestial judgment. To the local slave population, Margaret became something more than mortal, a demon sanctioned by heaven, a scourge whose power transcended reason. Escapees who previously believed flight to be feasible now hesitated, fearful that the very act of seeking freedom might summon wrath beyond human comprehension. Margaret's reputation extended beyond Harrogate, spreading along the network of trails used by escaping slaves. Messages of caution, whispered among terrified communities, conveyed the same chilling story. Do not stray near Harrogate. The widow waits. She knows the woods, and she knows you. The psychological impact of her campaigns became so potent that entire families abandoned their attempts to flee, choosing instead the slow, agonizing oppression of slavery over confrontation with a hunter whose abilities seemed supernatural. Her next victims, a group of 5 traveling north along the Great Wagon Road, became the subject of an even more elaborate campaign. Margaret spent days mapping their movements from concealment, noting the times they rested, where they drew water, and the patterns of their feet. She left symbolic messages along their route, fragments of scripture about the sins of rebellion, small tokens intended to resemble warnings from spirits, rather than a living human. By the time she confronted them, the group had already been psychologically disarmed, their cohesion fractured by the terror she had sown. The methodical nature of these killings drew the attention of those few authorities willing to note anomalies in the count. Sheriff Thomas Whitby recorded in his log, "It is as if a shadow hunts the living, a woman who appears when least expected, and leaves devastation behind." Yet despite official attention, Margaret evaded capture. She understood both the terrain and the limitations of law enforcement in a way that enabled her to operate freely. Whitby himself later admitted that the hunter's cunning surpassed anything he had encountered in 2 decades of service. By mid-1802, Margaret's campaigns had evolved beyond individual murders. She had begun incorporating hybrid rituals drawn from a mixture of Baptist, Methodist, and Catholic traditions, rearranging her crime scenes to suggest theological complexity. Her manipulation of biblical texts was no longer perfunctory. It was a calculated tool to amplify fear, to create the appearance of divine sanction, and to reinforce the myth of her invincibility. Observers who encountered remnants of her work often noted that the violence carried a deliberate message. Escape was not merely dangerous, it was cursed. The psychological warfare extended beyond her immediate victim. Neighboring plantations reported an uncanny stillness among enslaved populations, a pervasive fear that seeped into daily life. Conductors of the Underground Railroad noted that formerly reliable routes became deserted, and escapees who had previously demonstrated courage now faltered, deterred by reports of a widow demon who patrolled the forests of Harrogate. Margaret's influence, though confined geographically, created a ripple effect across central Virginia. Dr. Morton's notes from this period reveal his growing fascination mingled with horror. He described Margaret as a figure of intellect and terror, capable of both rational thought and ritualized cruelty in equal measure. He speculated that her practices might have evolved from grief and trauma, compounded by theological fanaticism and an insatiable appetite for control. What distinguished Margaret from other violent actors, Morton wrote, was her ability to compartmentalize. She maintained appearances within the community as a devoted Christian widow, while engaging in acts that defied every precept she publicly claimed to uphold. By late spring, Margaret's operations had assumed the precision of military campaigns. She divided her attention between multiple zones of pursuit, observing several groups of escapees simultaneously. Her journals indicate that she derived satisfaction not merely from the act of killing, but from the psychological unraveling that preceded it. The terror she induced was a tool, a mechanism to break her victims' resolve before physical confrontation became necessary. This sophistication marked a turning point, establishing her as the first of her kind in Virginia, a hunter who wielded both fear and faith as weapons. Local folklore, later collected by historians and folklorists, preserves fragments of the myth that Margaret cultivated. Stories speak of a woman who moved silently through forests, appearing without warning and vanishing just as mysteriously. Witnesses claimed she could anticipate the actions of those who fled, predicting paths and timing with a precision that seemed impossible. Some even alleged that the air around her carried a faint acrid smell like burned incense or copper that heralded her arrival. These accounts, while impossible to verify, reflect the terror she inspired and the manner in which legend merged with reality. In sum, the winter and spring of 1801-1802 marked the emergence of Margaret Rainsford, not merely as a murderer but as a phenomenon. Her crimes were systematic, her methodology unparalleled, and her psychological insight profound. She did not strike blindly, she studied, anticipated, and manipulated, transforming the act of pursuit into a form of theological performance. Every killing reinforced her myth, spreading fear that paralyzed entire communities and disrupted the fledgling operations of the Underground Railroad. As we proceed to the next stage of her story, it is essential to understand that Margaret's terror was not incidental. It was deliberate, calculated, and sustained. The families who vanished under her gaze were not merely unlucky, they were prey in a carefully managed campaign designed to assert dominion over both body and spirit. Her legacy, preserved in Morton's journals, the whispered accounts of escaped slaves, and the fragmented county records, offers an unprecedented window into the mind of a woman who redefined the nature of predation in early America. By the summer of 1802, the terror that Margaret Rainsford had meticulously cultivated throughout Harrogate and the surrounding counties had begun to reach a fevered pitch. Entire communities of enslaved people whispered her name in fear, teaching one another the routes to avoid, the warnings to heed, and the signs that she had been near. Margaret's campaign had evolved from sporadic killings to a coordinated, strategic effort to dominate the forested regions north of the James River. She no longer merely hunted individuals, she monitored the arteries of the Underground Railroad itself, striking not only to punish, but to dismantle the very network that offered hope to her intended prey. Margaret's methodology had matured to near perfection. She now combined psychological manipulation, religious symbolism, and precise logistical tracking into a comprehensive system of predation. Families attempting escape were first isolated, then subjected to a subtle yet unrelenting campaign of terror. Small tokens, burnt paper scraps, etched symbols on trees, or carefully arranged stones were left along their paths, each an imperceptible yet psychologically destabilizing warning. Selected biblical verses, always from passages emphasizing punishment for rebellion, were planted in places the fugitives were sure to discover. These calculated interventions sowed doubt, fear, and confusion, leaving her victims emotionally and mentally unprepared for the inevitable confrontation. Her first major target of this intensified campaign was the Harrow family, a group of 7 escapees fleeing a plantation south of Henrico County. Margaret had observed them for nearly 3 weeks, mapping every movement with painstaking care. She noted the children's behaviors, the father's patterns of vigilance, and the mother's responses to stress. The journals she kept from this period reveal a mind as meticulous as any military strategist. Father believes he can outpace me. He underestimates the forest. The children are fragile. Fear will bend them before I strike. Mother watches constantly yet cannot see the trap unfolding. Margaret employed a combination of physical and psychological tactics. She did not immediately attack. She first destabilized the family's confidence in their own judgment. Paths they had taken for safety were subtly altered with misleading signs, confusing markers or remnants of other travelers, making them doubt their decision. At night, faint sounds were arranged to suggest distant hunters or spectral presences, capitalizing on the community's superstitions. By the time she revealed herself, the family was psychologically fractured, their fear compounded by exhaustion and hopelessness. When the attack finally occurred, it was emblematic of her emerging signature. The bodies were arranged in a pattern resembling a macabre religious tableau. Scripture was burned and displayed. Candles and tokens from different Christian traditions were positioned near the victims, and even the environment itself, the trees, the creek, the layout of the clearing was carefully manipulated to create the appearance of divine judgment. Local law would later refer to this as the Harrow Massacre, and though few surviving accounts exist, its psychological reverberations were profound, reaching far beyond the immediate victim. The story circulated through word of mouth, chilling the broader population of enslaved people and conductors on the Underground Railroad alike. It was during this period that Margaret began drawing the attention of abolitionist networks operating in the mid-Atlantic. Rumors of a female hunter whose abilities defied comprehension reached Philadelphia and Baltimore, carried by those brave enough to flee and by sympathetic whites who quietly documented the account. Among those who took notice was Augustus Freeman, a former Virginia slave who had escaped 15 years prior and had become a leading figure in Philadelphia's abolitionist movement. Freeman, deeply familiar with the logistics of escape and the subtleties of tracking in hostile territories, recognized the gravity of the situation immediately. He understood that Margaret's activities threatened the very lifelines that enabled enslaved people to reach freedom. Freeman's network began collecting intelligence with remarkable speed. Underground Railroad operatives relayed first-hand accounts of missing families, cryptic symbols left along trails, and the horrifying theatricality of discovered bodies. The consistency and sophistication of Margaret's attacks suggested a mind both intelligent and meticulously methodical, a hunter operating with unprecedented skill. The challenge, Freeman realized, was extraordinary. Confronting a human predator who possessed intimate knowledge of the terrain, advanced tracking abilities, and a profound understanding of human psychology, ordinary law enforcement could not succeed. A calculated, clandestine intervention would be necessary. Margaret's expansion was not limited to geography but extended to method. She began incorporating hybrid religious symbolism into her attacks, drawing from multiple denominations to create scenes that were increasingly disturbing and theologically complex. Baptist, Methodist, and Catholic references intermingled in her displays, each carefully chosen to magnify the sense of divine sanction in the eyes of those who discovered her work. The strategy was simple yet horrifyingly effective. The terror was not only in her hand-to-hand lethality, but in the perception that she wielded the approval of a higher power. This period also revealed Margaret's capacity for psychological compartmentalization. In public, she maintained the facade of a grieving widow, attending church services and participating in local social affairs with apparent sincerity. Neighbors saw only a woman of refined manners, deeply devout and suffering the loss of her husband. Behind closed doors, however, her journals and preparations revealed the full extent of her methodical cruelty. This duality allowed her to operate with impunity, shielded by the community's assumptions about femininity and religious propriety. Even those closest to her could not reconcile the devout widow with the predator who stalked the forests. The summer of 1802 culminated in a particularly harrowing campaign against a teenage escapee named Josiah, who had fled alone from Powhatan County. Margaret stalked him for nearly a month, observing his routines, anticipating his movements, and engaging in a psychological campaign designed to convince him that supernatural forces were pursuing him. Josiah reported hearing whispers at night, finding scriptures scrawled along tree trunks, and observing inexplicable signs meant to suggest divine judgment. Margaret's sophistication was evident. The boy's terror was entirely of her making, and by the time she physically confronted him, he was so disoriented that he accepted her presence with a mixture of relief and dread. Yet it was also in this period that the limitations of her methodology became apparent. Freeman, observing reports and gathering intelligence from surviving escapees, recognized patterns in Margaret's behavior. Her careful preparation and reliance on ritual and symbolism created predictable pathways, both literal and psychological. Escape routes she preferred, methods she used to terrorize victims, and her reliance on religious iconography all offered openings for counter-strategy. Freeman began to conceive a plan that would not merely evade Margaret, but confront and neutralize her, using her own methods of psychological manipulation against her. By September, Freeman had assembled a team of 8 men, composed of escaped slaves and free blacks with extensive experience in clandestine operations. They included trackers capable of reading subtle signs invisible to outsiders, intelligence specialists able to gather information without alerting Margaret, and combat veterans skilled in ambush tactics. Each member understood the stakes. Failure meant not only personal danger, but the continued obstruction of escape routes vital to hundreds of enslaved people seeking freedom. The team's preparation was meticulous, involving days of surveillance, mapping Margaret's patterns, and studying her psychological and physical tendencies. Freeman's plan hinged on a careful simulation. A young operative named Samuel, resembling Margaret's typical prey in age, build, and travel habits, would stage a faux escape along routes she was known to monitor. Every step of the operation was calculated. Samuel's trail, the signals left behind, and his apparent exhaustion all served to draw Margaret into a controlled environment, where Freeman's team lay in concealment. The psychological sophistication of the plan mirrored Margaret's own. Just as she manipulated fear to control her victims, Freeman intended to manipulate her expectations to trap the predator herself. The culmination of this strategy occurred in a small clearing near Mill Creek. Margaret, drawn by Samuel's trail, approached with the confidence that had allowed her to dominate Harrogate for nearly 2 years. Yet unbeknownst to her, Freeman's men were concealed along the perimeter, rifles poised with lines of sight carefully chosen to control her movement. Margaret's experience and physical prowess were formidable. She moved with a predator's instinct, anticipating resistance, calculating force, and prepared to assert her lethal dominance. But the careful orchestration of Freeman's team meant that she was now operating under the same constraints she had imposed on so many others. As Margaret closed in on Samuel, the ambush was executed with precision. Rifles fired in synchronized volleys, halting her advance and inflicting multiple wounds. Margaret's strength and size allowed her to withstand injuries that would have felled ordinary men, yet even her extraordinary constitution could not counter the carefully calculated tactical advantage of Freeman's team. The confrontation that followed her struggle, her defiance, and the systematic subjugation of a predator, who had terrified an entire region, would become the defining episode of her career. In this phase of her life, Margaret Rainsford's dual legacy became clear. She had cultivated terror and mythology through meticulous observation, ritualistic violence, and psychological warfare. Her campaigns had reshaped escape networks and imposed an unprecedented psychological barrier on the enslaved population. Yet her sophistication also created vulnerabilities, patterns that could be studied and exploited by those with equal cunning. By late 1802, the stage was set for her final confrontation, a reckoning that would challenge the very notion of invincibility she had so carefully constructed. By the early days of September 1802, the balance of power in Henrico County had begun to shift. For nearly 2 years, Margaret Rainsford had ruled the forests and rivers with an almost supernatural precision, striking terror into the hearts of enslaved people and those who sought to help them. She had stalked families, children, and lone escapees, with a combination of brute force, psychological manipulation, and ritualistic symbolism that rendered conventional law enforcement helpless. Yet the arrival of Augustus Freeman and his carefully assembled team of Underground Railroad operatives marked a turning point, a moment when the hunter would become the hunted. Freeman had meticulously studied Margaret's patterns for weeks. He observed her nocturnal excursions, her methods of laying psychological traps, and even her ritualistic preparations before each hunt. Through painstaking surveillance, Freeman identified the subtle but consistent behaviors that betrayed Margaret's overconfidence, the preferred hunting corridors she followed, the types of victims she targeted, and the symbolic objects she carried to assert her theological ration. This intelligence formed the backbone of a counterplan that mirrored Margaret's own psychological strategies, designed to exploit her predictability. The key to Freeman's strategy was Samuel, a young operative chosen for his resemblance to the typical escapee Margaret favored. Samuel's mission was to stage a vulnerable, solitary escape along the corridors she had previously dominated. Every detail was calibrated to trigger Margaret's instincts: worn clothing, strategic signs along the path, faint traces of campfires, and subtle misdirections that suggested desperation and isolation. Freeman's team prepared a concealed ambush site near Mill Creek, a clearing surrounded by dense undergrowth offering clear lines of sight for the men, while limiting Margaret's options for retreat. The culmination of the operation began on the night of September. Samuel departed from a location approximately 10 miles south of the Bender estate, following a path designed to mimic an authentic escape. Margaret discovered the trail within 2 days, exactly as Freeman had predicted. Her journal entries from this period, recovered later, revealed a familiar thrill, the promise of a seemingly easy kill, a healthy male traveling alone, entirely within her domain. She began her customary process of observation, unaware that Freeman's team monitored every step. For nearly a week, Margaret pursued Samuel with all the skill and cunning that had earned her the fear-based title of the Demon of Henrico. She moved silently through forests, read subtle signs invisible to ordinary eyes, and tracked her quarry with relentless patience. Each day, Freeman's team adjusted their positions, maintaining concealment while gathering data on her approach. They had anticipated her every tactic: the use of ritual objects, the manipulation of natural terrain, and her capacity for psychological intimidation. Now, the hunter who had terrorized an entire region was operating within an environment meticulously controlled by her adversaries. On the morning of September 29th, Margaret approached the clearing near Mill Creek. Samuel had built a small fire the previous evening, creating the illusion of a momentary lapse in vigilance. To Margaret, he represented an ideal target, isolated, exhausted, and within striking distance. Her approach was swift and confident, the same explosive speed that had allowed her to dominate previous victims. Yet as her massive hands closed around Samuel, 7 rifles fired almost simultaneously from concealed position. Musket balls tore through the air, striking Margaret in multiple locations: chest, arm, and thigh. Yet her extraordinary constitution allowed her to survive the initial volley. To Freeman's team, it was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The stories of Margaret's inhuman strength suddenly made sense in a visceral way. Margaret struggled to rise, her colossal frame defying wounds that would have felled any ordinary person. Her hands reached for Samuel, her intent to kill undiminished by pain or blood loss. Freeman, maintaining calm and control, emerged from concealment with a loaded pistol, closing the distance to within 10 feet of her position. The confrontation was now both physical and psychological. Margaret's first words, spoken with blood-frothed lips, were threats rather than pleas. She proclaimed herself an instrument of divine vengeance, chosen to punish those who defied the natural order she believed God had ordained. Her arrogance remained unshaken even as her body betrayed her. Freeman's response was methodical, devoid of emotion. He identified himself as a representative of the Underground Railroad, and informed Margaret that her reign of terror had ended. Over the next 30 minutes, he conducted a formal interrogation,
recording every word and every revelation. Margaret's responses were chillingly precise. She described murders that had never been reported, techniques she had used to terrorize victims, and the psychological strategies she employed to ensure compliance. She boasted of the families she had destroyed, the individuals she had manipulated, and the symbolic displays she had crafted to convey divine judgment. Regret was absent. Satisfaction at her perceived success was abundant.
As her strength waned, Margaret revealed the location of a concealed cellar beneath her estate, a repository for her trophies, clothing fragments, personal effects, and preserved body parts from her victims. The cellar contained at least 47 individual items, nearly twice the number of murders that had been attributed to the mysterious killer in public records. Each item was meticulously catalogued, labeled, and preserved, a grim testament to her methodical nature. Her journal, discovered alongside the cellar, provided even deeper insights into her psychological evolution from grieving widow to one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Freeman's team spent the remainder of the day cataloging the evidence. They recovered the stored items, mapped the Bender property, and identified additional remains that had not yet been discovered. The intelligence gathered was unparalleled, offering the Underground Railroad unprecedented insight into the methods of a highly organized and intelligent predator. Freeman's meticulous records would later serve as tactical guidance for operations aimed at safeguarding escapees in Virginia and beyond. The immediate psychological impact of Margaret's capture was profound. The myth of her invincibility, which had paralyzed escape attempts across central Virginia, was permanently shattered. Local enslaved communities, who had long whispered of the demon in the forest, now had proof that even the most feared predator could be defeated by intelligence, preparation, and coordination. Freeman's operation became legendary within Underground Railroad networks, demonstrating that methodical planning and collective action could overcome terror, no matter how deeply it was ingrained in the landscape and the minds of the oppressed. Margaret Rainsford, who had orchestrated murder, psychological warfare, and theological justification on a scale previously unimaginable, died as she had lived, surrounded by the consequences of violence. Her massive body, finally immobilized by musket balls and her own failing constitution, was buried in an unmarked grave deep in the forest she had claimed as her hunting ground. Freeman's team deliberately left no monument, ensuring that Margaret's legacy would be recorded only in the meticulous documentation of her crimes and in the folklore that would persist in whispers among enslaved communities. The Bender estate itself was abandoned shortly thereafter. Overgrown vegetation and the reclaiming forces of nature erased most of the physical traces of her life and crimes. Local residents spoke in hushed tones of curses and restless spirits, though few knew the full extent of Margaret's systematic terror. Official records remained vague, suggesting that the killer had vanished or succumbed to unknown circumstances. In truth, the full story, her methods, motivations, and the breadth of her killings was known only to a select circle of Underground Railroad operatives who understood the importance of secrecy in preventing further exploitation or imitation of her techniques. The long-term consequences of Margaret's actions were both tactical and psychological. Routes through central Virginia remained largely abandoned for years after her death. Slaves and conductors who had survived her reign spoke of her campaigns as a cautionary tale, a reminder of both human ingenuity and human capacity for evil. The myth of the demon in the forest became a tool for warning and education, a way to convey the dangers of venturing into hostile territory without preparation or support. Yet alongside the terror there was also hope. The eventual triumph over Margaret demonstrated that even the most sophisticated predators could be confronted and neutralized with careful planning, courage, and collective effort. Margaret's life and crimes remain a stark example of how ordinary people can be transformed by personal trauma, systemic oppression, and ideological justifications into agents of extraordinary evil. She was not born a monster, but the confluence of grief, societal reinforcement of racial hierarchy, and the opportunity for unchecked violence produced a mind capable of calculated murder and psychological warfare. Her story also serves as a reminder of the resilience and bravery of those who opposed her, the escaped slaves, conductors, and abolitionists who risked everything to protect lives and dismantle terror. Ultimately, the narrative of Margaret Rainsford, the woman who hunted and killed escaped slaves, demonstrates the duality of human potential. On one hand, her crimes reveal how cruelty, when combined with intelligence and opportunity, can wreak havoc on entire communities. On the other, the success of Freeman and his team illustrates the power of strategic thinking, solidarity, and courage in the face of overwhelming evil. The forests of Henrico County, once the scene of her dominance, eventually became a symbol of both human terror and human triumph. Margaret Rainsford's legacy, her journal, her cellar of trophies, and the horror she inflicted, remains a chilling reminder of the dangers of unrestrained power, the capacity for ordinary individuals to commit extraordinary violence, and the necessity of vigilance and collective action to confront threats to life and liberty. Though her physical presence was erased by time and nature, the psychological and historical impact of her deeds endured, offering lessons for generations about the limits of human morality, the consequences of unchecked ideology, and the enduring struggle for justice in the face of systematic terror. The forests grew silent, the estates crumbled, and the whispered stories persisted. A woman of massive stature, formidable intelligence, and unyielding belief in her divine mandate, who preyed upon the vulnerable until finally outmatched by the cunning, bravery, and strategic planning of those who refused to surrender to fear. Margaret Rainsford's story, dark and horrifying as it is, remains a testament to the complexities of human nature and the enduring power of courage over terror. The aftermath of Margaret Rainsford's reign of terror left an indelible mark on Henrico County, its enslaved communities, and the Underground Railroad. While her physical presence was eradicated, the psychological scars she left behind were profound. For years, families whispered stories of the demon in the forest, cautionary tales that mixed fear with survival wisdom. These legends were rooted in real horror: the 47 confirmed victims of her killings, the families torn apart, the bodies meticulously staged to suggest divine wrath, and the terror she had spread with both brute force and religious manipulation. The successful operation led by Augustus Freeman was more than just a tactical victory. It was a symbolic turning point in the struggle against systematic violence in early America. Freeman's team had demonstrated that intelligence, planning, and courage could counter even the most overwhelming and psychologically sophisticated threat. The ambush near Mill Creek and the subsequent discovery of the hidden cellar revealed not only the scale of Margaret's crimes, but also the effectiveness of coordinated resistance against a predator who had relied on fear and deception to dominate her environment. Freeman's detailed reports and the evidence recovered from the Bender estate served multiple purposes. First, they allowed Underground Railroad leaders to understand the full range of tactics employed by bounty hunters and rogue predators, enabling better protection for those attempting escape. The cataloging of Margaret's trophies and the analysis of her journals provided invaluable insight into the mind of a serial killer, including how trauma, ideology, and opportunity could converge to produce extraordinary acts of cruelty. Second, the documentation ensured that her crimes could not be entirely erased by time, myth, or the deliberate obfuscation of official record. Where newspapers and law enforcement had offered vague reports and speculation, Freeman's work created an empirical record, grounded in observation and evidence, that preserved the truth for future generations. Margaret's psychological profile, as revealed in her journals and observed behaviors, has fascinated historians and psychologists alike. She evolved from a grieving widow into a meticulously organized serial killer, demonstrating an extraordinary capacity for compartmentalization. She could attend church on Sunday mornings, interact socially with neighbors, and maintain a facade of normalcy, while spending the remainder of her time hunting, torturing, and murdering those she considered beneath her divinely ordained state. Her ability to maintain these dual identities without apparent cognitive dissonance illustrates a form of mental dissociation that allowed her to function at both extremes simultaneously. Religious ideology was central to Margaret's justification for her action. By framing slavery as a divine mandate and escape attempts as rebellion against God's natural order, she created a moral framework that rationalized mass murder. Each victim became a symbolic sacrifice, and her rituals reinforced the belief that she was an instrument of divine justice. This theological overlay not only guided her killings, but also amplified their psychological impact, ensuring that survivors and observers interpreted her actions as supernatural or sanctioned by higher powers. The combination of religious symbolism, psychological manipulation, and physical violence made her one of the most sophisticated and terrifying predators in American history. Yet, her success also sowed the seeds of her own downfall. Margaret's overconfidence, reliance on predictable patterns, and preoccupation with ritualized murder left her vulnerable to an opponent who could exploit those same traits. Freeman's team demonstrated that careful observation, patience, and an understanding of the predator's psychology could reverse roles. The operation to capture Margaret illustrates a timeless principle in the study of violence and strategy. Even the most cunning and ruthless individuals can be neutralized when opponents combine intelligence,
preparation, and collective effort. The long-term impact on the Underground Railroad cannot be overstated. While Margaret's campaign had temporarily shut down routes through central Virginia, her death allowed a gradual resurgence of escape activity. Conductors used Freeman's reports to educate new generations of operatives, teaching them how to recognize threats, interpret patterns, and avoid traps. The psychological power of her myth, while initially paralyzing, eventually became a source of practical knowledge. Survivors and witnesses shared their experiences, ensuring that the terror she inspired was transformed into actionable guidance for those committed to helping enslaved people reach freedom. Margaret's story also serves as a broader reflection on the capacity for evil within ordinary human beings. She was not born a monster. She was shaped by personal trauma, social conditioning, and ideological reinforcement. The system of slavery, which dehumanized both enslaved individuals and those who enforced its rules, provided fertile ground for her development into a predator. Her crimes force us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, that ordinary people, given power, opportunity, and ideological justification, can commit acts of extraordinary violence. In Margaret's case, grief, personal vendetta, and theological delusions converged to create a uniquely lethal combination. Historians examining the Henrico County killings note that the story also highlights the importance of vigilance, community resistance, and strategic thinking in the face of systemic threat. Freeman and his team succeeded not because of brute force alone, but because they anticipated Margaret's actions, studied her methods, and coordinated their response with precision. Their success underscores a key principle: knowledge and preparation are as crucial as courage when confronting entrenched systems of violence or highly organized predators. The societal implications of Margaret's crimes extend beyond her immediate victim. Her ability to manipulate religious ideology, exploit systemic racism, and weaponize fear demonstrates how structures of power and belief can be twisted to serve violent ends. This provides a cautionary lesson about the dangers of unquestioned authority and the ways in which cultural, religious, and social narratives can be manipulated to justify harm. Her actions remind us that evil often hides behind a veneer of normalcy, respectability, and moral justification, making vigilance and critical thinking essential for safeguarding vulnerable populations. In the decades following Margaret's death, the Henrico County forests slowly returned to a state of natural quiet. The Bender estate, once the center of horror, was reclaimed by nature. Official records remained minimal, often vague, and sometimes misleading, as local authorities preferred to avoid the complexities of confronting her crimes directly. However, within Underground Railroad networks and abolitionist circles, the full story remained alive. Freeman's meticulous reports and first-hand accounts ensured that the knowledge of Margaret's methods and the lessons learned from her capture were preserved. This information proved vital in protecting future escapees and in shaping strategies against violent individuals who sought to exploit the system for personal or ideological gain. Psychologically, Margaret's story remains a powerful case study. It illustrates the stages by which an individual can progress from grief and personal trauma to ideological extremism, moral rationalization, and ultimately, systematic violence. Her ability to blend normal social behavior with predatory acts challenges conventional understandings of criminality and emphasizes the importance of considering both psychological and socio-cultural factors in understanding extreme behavior. Modern criminologists often cite her case when examining the intersection of ideology, trauma, and serial predation. Finally, the legacy of Margaret Rainsford, alias Kate Bender, endures as a cautionary tale and historical lesson. It is a narrative of terror, strategy, and resistance, demonstrating both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human ingenuity in countering it. Her story underscores the dual potential within every human heart, the capacity for both profound evil and extraordinary courage. It reminds us that vigilance, preparation, and collective action are necessary to confront threats, whether they arise from individuals or from systemic injustices. The forests of Henrico County, long haunted by whispered stories of the demon in the woods, now stand as a silent testament to this dark chapter in American history. Margaret's physical presence has vanished, her estate reclaimed by nature, but the lessons she left behind continue to resonate about the dangers of unchecked power, the psychological consequences of fear, and the enduring struggle between oppression and liberation. In the end, Margaret Rainsford's life and death offer a stark reflection on human nature, morality, and the capacity for both destruction and resilience. The meticulous planning, theological rationalization, and sheer physical power that defined her reign of terror were ultimately overcome not by luck or chance, but by courage, strategy and the collective determination of those committed to justice. Her story endures as a chilling reminder of what is possible when fear and ideology combine, and as an equally powerful reminder that even the most formidable predators can be brought down by intelligence, preparation, and the myth of the demon in Henrico County, once a source of terror, has transformed into a historical lesson. Margaret Rainsford's crimes serve as a mirror, reflecting both the darkest capacities of human behavior and the extraordinary potential of organized intelligent resistance. They compel us to consider the moral choices we make, the systems we uphold, and the ways in which courage, foresight and collaboration can confront even the most daunting threat. Through this lens, her story becomes not only a tale of horror, but also a testament to human resilience, ingenuity and the enduring fight for freedom and justice.
When the militia withdrew in February 1802, Henrico County did not return to peace. Instead, the absence of official oversight created a vacuum in which rumor and fear flourished. Those who had once dared to flee plantations now whispered more about the demon in the woods than about the dogs or overseers that might chase them. Margaret Rainsford, though stripped of her husband and of ordinary domesticity, had gained something more potent, the status of a figure larger than law. She no longer merely hunted. She experimented. The journals seized from her home after the final ambush reveal an unnerving preoccupation with anatomy. Written in a steady, deliberate hand, the entries combined scripture with methodical observation. She dissected not for medical purpose, nor even for curiosity, but to prove to herself that her victims were not of the same flesh as she. To Margaret, the color of their skins signified a different order of creation, and so she sought confirmation within the opened body. Her notes remark upon muscle fiber, tendon resilience, and lung capacity, recorded beside verses from Leviticus or Romans, as though the Bible itself endorsed her grisly autopsy. In one passage she observes that the heart of an older man withstood strangulation longer than expected, and she cross-references this with a sermon she had once heard about the stiff-necked sins of age. Elsewhere she remarks upon the smallness of a young woman's hands, fit only to grasp at vanity, before describing in detail the process of severing the fingers and preserving them in salt. The juxtaposition of spiritual judgment with bodily mutilation speaks to a mind that no longer distinguished between theology and experiment. For Margaret, each corpse was a text to be studied, annotated, and displayed. The cellar beneath her house, described in Freeman's report, resembled less a burial ground than a laboratory. Bones were arranged upon shelves, not in random heaps but in categories, skulls in one alcove, rib cages in another, femurs stacked with mathematical neatness. Articles of clothing were hung as though in a wardrobe, though stained and torn. What unsettled Freeman most were the sketches, crude yet deliberate drawings pinned to the walls, depicting dissected torsos beside biblical quotations. These were not the works of an illiterate murderer, but of a woman determined to give scholarly shape to her theology of cruelty. The escalation during the spring of 1802 confirmed what the journals suggested. Margaret no longer contented herself with swift ambushes. She devised longer trials in which the victim was kept alive while she recorded pulse, breath, and cries. Survivors' accounts are rare, but one woman, rescued half-mad from the woods, spoke of being bound and forced to listen as Margaret recited scripture over her body, pausing to mark how long she could scream before her voice broke. Whether every detail of that testimony was accurate matters less than the fact that the community believed it. Fear swelled not only from killings but from the anticipation of what might be done before death. The broader social order responded slowly. Planters, though concerned about their property losses, were reluctant to publicize the truth. To admit that a white widow had been slaughtering fugitives with religious zeal would undermine the very system of control upon which their wealth depended. Thus much of Margaret's reign went unrecorded in newspapers, dismissed as slave folklore or unsubstantiated reports. It fell instead to Freeman and the clandestine network of conductors to preserve the record. They did so with the precision of physicians writing case studies, listing dates, locations, and methods of killing, so that others might be forewarned. This deliberate cataloging transformed Margaret from a local terror into a case study in systemic pathology. She was not merely a criminal aberration, but the logical consequence of a culture steeped in violence, theology, and racial hierarchy. Her dissections mirrored, in grotesque miniature, the justifications of slavery itself, that bodies of the enslaved could be measured, prodded, broken, and the horror of Margaret Rainsford lay not only in her personal savagery, but in how seamlessly it echoed the larger society's sanctioned cruelties. It is telling that she saw herself not as a murderer but as a teacher. Her journals repeatedly speak of instruction, of demonstrating the wages of rebellion. She imagined each corpse as a sermon made flesh, each mutilated form as a warning to others who might flee. In this she was both executioner and professor, constructing an academy of terror in the very woods, where fugitives once sought freedom. That her legacy endured in whispers long after her body was laid in the ground testifies to the effectiveness of her pedagogy. The psychological toll extended beyond her victims. Even those who never encountered her directly felt her influence. Families on plantations hesitated to attempt escape, haunted by the image of bodies suspended from trees. Conductors altered routes, sometimes adding weeks to journeys, lest they pass through her claimed territory. The Underground Railroad became not merely a physical path, but a psychological labyrinth, shaped as much by fear of Margaret as by the geography of rivers and forests. Scholars who later studied Freeman's notes have remarked upon the uncanny parallel between Margaret's methods and the emerging sciences of her century. Anatomy, phrenology, and moral theology all converged in her practice, though twisted beyond recognition. Where physicians dissected to heal, she dissected to condemn. Where theologians preached to save souls, she preached to justify their destruction. Her cellar was thus both laboratory and chapel, a shrine to the grotesque marriage of science and superstition. The spring of 1802 therefore marked the height of her power, not in numbers of victims alone, but in the refinement of her ideology. No longer content to be a predator, she had become an archivist of death. Each killing was a datum, each journal entry a thesis, each corpse a citation. Her work resembled the construction of a dark encyclopedia, one intended not for public libraries but for the silence of the grave. Freeman himself, reflecting years later, confessed to nightmares in which he walked again into that cellar, surrounded by bones and scripture, and felt as though he were inside the pages of a book written in blood. It was not the corpses that most horrified me, he wrote, but the order of them. To see death so arranged, so classified, was to glimpse a mind that had made peace with cruelty by giving it the form of scholarship. Thus Part 6 closes with Margaret Rainsford, at her most methodical, her killings elevated to a doctrine of fear. She had surpassed vengeance, surpassed even the thrill of the hunt. She was now a chronicler of her own depravity, convinced that she was recording truths for an eternal audience. It was this conviction that made her, in the eyes of both survivors and scholars, less a mere murderer than an institution, a one-woman university of horror, inscribing her lessons upon the very flesh of her victims. By midsummer of 1802, Margaret Rainsford's dominion seemed unassailable. Her tally of victims exceeded 36 by the most conservative estimate, and whispers among the enslaved inflated the number to nearly double. But the very perfection of her system contained its flaw. The more precise her methods became, the more predictable her routines grew. What she mistook for mastery was in truth repetition, a rhythm that skilled observers could exploit. It was Augustus Freeman who first traced the circle. Having charted every known murder site, he noticed that they fell within a rough perimeter of forest and swamp, all radiating from the shell of the Rainsford plantation house. Margaret had long disguised her habitation there, but careful eyes discerned the signs: smoke drifting from a chimney at hours when no tenant farmer worked nearby, faint tracks where grass should have swallowed paths, and the occasional glint of metal near hedgerows that suggested traps. Freeman's team had spent months building trust among the enslaved community, quietly gathering testimonies that white constables had dismissed as superstition. From these fragments a portrait emerged, a widow who moved like a shadow, who left scripture, nailed to trees, who arranged corpses in postures no mortal hand should contrive. To many she was a specter, but Freeman insisted she was flesh and blood, and flesh could bleed. The plan they devised was simple in outline yet perilous in execution. One of their number, Samuel, would pose as a runaway youth, leaving signs of flight where Margaret's eye would surely find them. The rest of the team would remain hidden, drawing her into a pre-selected clearing beside Mill Creek. There the ambush would spring, rifles leveled, exit routes cut off. Yet all knew the danger. Margaret was no ordinary opponent. Her strength, her cunning, and the aura of dread she inspired made even seasoned men shiver when they spoke her name. For a week Samuel played his role. He moved as fugitives, truly moved, half-starved, careless in his concealment, leaving broken twigs and muddy prints as bait. Margaret followed. Freeman's journals describe her patience: nights spent watching Samuel's campfires, days spent shadowing him through thickets, always circling, never rushing the kill. She treated him as she had treated dozens before, an experiment to be observed before consumed. Unbeknownst to her, she too was under observation. Freeman's men tracked both hunter and hunted, noting her positions, mapping her approach, calculating when she would strike. The climax came in the early hours of September. Samuel had kindled a small fire in the clearing, feigning exhaustion. Around him, concealed in brush and behind trees, 7 rifles waited. Margaret entered as she always did, sudden, silent, brutal. She lunged for his throat, but instead of yielding like her past victims, Samuel twisted free, crying the signal. The forest erupted with musket fire. The volley struck home. Bullets tore through chest, arm, and thigh, dropping the widow to the ground. Yet she did not die. Witnesses spoke of her rising on one knee, blood pouring from her mouth. Eyes wild with fury, she crawled toward the trees, dragging her shattered limb, still intent on pursuit. Even seasoned fighters felt dread then, for the stories of her unnatural vitality seemed confirmed. Freeman stepped forward with pistol drawn. His voice was steady, though his heart thudded. He demanded her surrender, though he knew she would not yield. Margaret spat blood and scripture in equal measure. She proclaimed herself God's chosen scourge, vowed that her mission would outlive her body, warned that the graves of slaves would multiply long after her. Freeman did not argue theology. He asked for facts: how many she had killed, where the bodies lay, what trophies she had kept. To the astonishment of all, she answered, whether through arrogance, delirium, or a final desire to have her work acknowledged. Margaret spoke freely. She listed victims thought merely missing, described hunts no one had witnessed, gave directions to the hidden cellar beneath her house. Her tone was not one of confession but of lecture, as though she were still instructing an audience in the righteousness of her craft. The interrogation lasted half an hour. Blood loss made her voice falter, yet her mind remained cold and clear. Only when she spoke of her husband did her composure waver. She claimed satisfaction in having avenged him 100-fold, declaring that every throat crushed was an offering to his memory. Then, with breath failing and eyes glazed, she gave her last revelation, the location of her trophies, carefully preserved as proof of her devotion. Moments later, silence claimed her. Freeman ordered the body buried deep in the forest, unmarked. No monument, no trial, no public hanging would preserve her name. The risk of white authorities twisting the tale, or of her legend growing still more powerful, was too great. Better that the widow dissolve into earth, her bones indistinguishable from the countless she had scattered. Yet erasure proved impossible. Freeman's team uncovered the cellar exactly as she had described, shelves of bones, clothing, and grisly keepsakes catalogued with eerie precision. They documented 47 distinct victims, though they suspected more. The journals too survived, each page a chilling blend of scripture and dissection notes. These Freeman copied and circulated among trusted abolitionists, ensuring that Margaret's methods were studied not as admiration but as warning. The psychological wound she left proved harder to heal. For years after, escapees whispered of a white demoness who patrolled the Virginia woods. Even when told she was dead, many could not believe it. Fear had rooted too deeply. Routes through central Virginia remained abandoned, and conductors were forced to chart longer, riskier paths. The shadow of Margaret Rainsford thus outlived her flesh, a testament to how terror lingers when sown with method. Historians now regard her as one of the earliest documented serial killers on American soil, but her significance exceeds number. She embodied the convergence of slavery's violence, patriarchal theology, and the obsessive order of early modern science. She was not madness alone, but a mirror held to her society. In dissecting bodies, she reenacted the dissection of humanity that slavery itself required. In staging tableau, she dramatized the rituals of control already embedded in plantation life. Freeman, writing in old age, reflected on the day he watched her die. It was not her strength that frightened me most, he confessed, but her search. She believed herself righteous even as blood choked her lungs. That is the most terrible power evil possesses, the conviction that it serves good. The death of Margaret Rainsford on September 29th, yet in truth, it marked only the beginning of a subtler, more insidious battle, not for bodies, but for memory. Freeman and his companions buried her body in silence, but silence of another kind soon followed. The silence of official records, carefully manufactured. When word of the widow's deeds reached the magistrates of Henrico and Hanover, they reacted not with public trials or proclamations, but with studied dismissal. To acknowledge that a white woman had preyed upon fugitives with such ferocity would be to unravel the very narrative of order upon which the South depended. Better, they decided, that Margaret vanish into rumor, than stand as proof of what cruelty the system had bred in its own image. Thus began the suppression. Reports were sealed, journals hidden, testimonies discredited. Freeman, who had gathered so many details, found his credibility questioned. He was accused of exaggeration, of fabricating horrors to bolster the abolitionist cause. Those who had stood beside him at Mill Creek were pressured into silence. A few relented, erasing their own accounts. Others clung to truth, but their words circulated only in whispers. Letters passed hand to hand in coded language. The widow's cellar, however, could not be denied. Too many had seen it,
Yet here too the magistrates intervened. They ordered the remains interred hastily, stripped of context. Clothing was burned, bones piled together into mass. The careful order Margaret had imposed upon her trophies was undone, as though to erase not only the victims, but the logic of her cruelty. The cellar itself was collapsed, its stones scattered, its mouth buried beneath soil. By winter, little remained but a scar of earth, where once the archive of death had stood. But erasure, like infection, cannot be so easily contained. Survivors carried their memories northward, embedding Margaret's shadow into the oral tradition of those who fled bondage. Conductors on the Underground Railroad repeated her name as warning, reshaping her into myth. The demoness of Virginia, the widow who hunted with scripture in hand, the white specter that struck in the night. In these retellings, Margaret became less woman than curse, proof that freedom's path was haunted not only by dogs and chains, but by something more relentless, the hatred of a society determined to make examples of the defiant. Freeman himself faced a cruel paradox. He had sought to document, to preserve truth, believing that sunlight might cleanse the wound. Instead, his writings became dangerous. Possessing them marked one as agitator, circulating them invited reprisal. He concealed his notebooks in hidden compartments, showing them only to trusted allies. It was in these secret gatherings that Margaret's story continued, not as public history, but as underground scripture, whispered in the same breath as coded directions and secret hymns. Meanwhile, the official narrative hard. Plantation owners spoke of a mad woman, untethered from reason, whose killings bore no relevance to larger society. Ministers preached sermons about Eve's weakness, about how women left unguided by husbands fell prey to Satan's snare. In this retelling, Margaret became not a reflection of slavery's brutality, but a cautionary tale of feminine frailty. Her victims, conveniently, were not named in these accounts. They became background, their suffering erased while Margaret's madness was paraded as spectacle. The wider world, when it heard of her at all, received only fragments. A brief notice in the Richmond Gazette referred to a deranged widow apprehended for violent deeds in the countryside, omitting the racial and political dimensions. No number of victims was mentioned, no acknowledgement of her theology, her dissections, her trophies, just a woman, briefly mad, quickly gone. The curtain of silence descended.
Yet silence carries its own disquiet. Those who had seen her cellar firsthand reported recurring visions. One man confessed he could not walk into a church without recalling bones arranged like pews, skulls as congregants. Margaret herself the preacher. Another swore that every time he opened a Bible he smelled the acrid stench of her cellar as though scripture itself had been tainted. Such memories haunted even the most devout, eroding faith. The widow had not only murdered bodies, she had desecrated texts, transforming the word into a weapon of slaughter. Freeman in his later writings identified this as her truest legacy, not the tally of corpses but the corruption of faith into science of cruelty. What Margaret revealed, he wrote, is that no creed is safe from perversion. She proved that the very words of salvation may be turned scalpel, dissecting not only flesh but the soul of a people. His phrase, scalpel of the soul, would appear again in abolitionist pamphlets decades later, a reminder that the war against bondage was also a war against theologies that sanctified violence. The suppression, however, worked more thoroughly than Freeman feared. By the mid-19th century, Margaret Rainsford's name had nearly vanished from official memory. She survived only in folklore lumped together with tales of witches and haunts. A child frightened at night might be told, "Hush, or the widow will hear you." Plantation owners even found utility in the myth, deploying it as threat to keep slaves from wandering too far. Stray into the woods and Margaret will claim you. Thus the very system that had birthed her found new ways to exploit her specter, folding her back into its machinery of fear. For scholars today, piecing together her life is an exercise in contradiction. The official archives hold almost nothing. What survives comes from the margins, letters, journals, testimonies preserved in secrecy. In these fragments we glimpse both the enormity of her crimes and the enormity of their concealment. Margaret Rainsford is thus remembered doubly, once as the terror she enacted, and again as the silence imposed upon her tale. It is this duality that gives Part 8 its resonance. The widow was slain, her cellar razed, her story silenced. Yet through suppression she gained a second life, less corporeal but no less potent. For what is more terrifying than a truth so dangerous it must be buried? The answer lies in the enduring whispers, in the coded songs of escapees, in the private writings of men like Freeman. Her story lived not in bookshelves but in breath, a shadow traveling as swiftly as those who ran for freedom. By 1803 Virginia appeared quiet once more. The forests regrew, concealing the scars. The Rainsford house crumbled into ruin, but in the minds of those who remembered, the silence itself became the loudest testimony. Margaret's work was gone, yet the fear of her lingered, and in that lingering her power endured. By the spring of 1803, Margaret Rainsford was gone from the earth, but the weight of her deeds remained, pressing upon the living with an authority equal to that of scripture or law. She had been flesh and bone, a widow turned predator, yet what survived of her was not her body but her legend, malleable, contested, shaped according to the needs of those who remembered or suppressed. For the enslaved, Margaret became a phantom woven into the very fabric of resistance. Stories of her cruelty were whispered at night in cabins, sung in veiled hymns, passed between those who contemplated escape. Some tales exaggerated her powers to supernatural dimensions. She could vanish into mist, walk through walls, track the scent of fear itself. Others spoke of her as punishment made flesh, a living reminder that every path to freedom carried shadows as well as light. Yet within these stories lay an unexpected weapon. Forewarned, conductors on the Underground Railroad invoked her name to impress upon fugitives the need for caution, urging vigilance in forests where danger might lurk behind any tree. Fear became instruction, and instruction became survival. For the masters, Margaret was more complicated. To admit the full extent of her campaign would be to confess that white society, far from being a bulwark of civilization, had birthed monsters from its own soil. Thus plantation owners recast her memory into parable, the mad widow, the hysterical woman undone by grief, an aberration unconnected to the greater order. In some sermons she was likened to Lilith, the archetype of feminine rebellion. In others she was dismissed entirely, her story reduced to local gossip not worth repeating. But even in denial her shadow loomed. Planters used her legend to frighten the enslaved, telling them the woods were haunted by a pale huntress who claimed all who strayed. Thus the same system that had denied her victims their names, now wielded her as tool of intimidation, stripping her violence of context, and turning it into allegory for obedience. Freeman meanwhile waged his lonely campaign of preservation. He copied his notes in secret, dispersing them across a network of abolitionist allies. Some pages found their way into northern cities, where sympathetic printers issued pamphlets that circulated quietly among reformist circles. In these accounts Margaret was neither demon nor madwoman, but proof incarnate of the rot at slavery's core. What she enacted with her hands, one pamphlet declared, is but the logical consequence of bondage itself, the reduction of men to flesh, of women to vessels, of scripture to weapon. Such writings did not reach wide audiences, suppression was too thorough, distribution too perilous, but they planted seeds that would bear fruit decades later, when abolitionist rhetoric needed examples of slavery's inhumanity. Margaret Rainsford became one such example, not anomaly, but emblem. The contradiction of her legacy lay in its multiplicity. To some she was madness, to others myth, to still others, symbol of slavery's ultimate corruption. In this fragmentation she achieved a form of immortality, one not granted by monuments or gravestones, but by the persistence of fear and fascination. Every retelling distorted her, yet each distorted her, yet each distortion carried truth in its own way. Even in death, Margaret influenced the behavior of those who fled. Routes shifted northward, away from Henrico and Hanover, carving new paths through Maryland and Pennsylvania. Conductors warned fugitives to avoid certain valleys, certain abandoned barns. Even long after the widow had been slain, her presence lingered not in body but in geography, shaping the map of resistance like a scar that dictates the motion of flesh, long after the wound has healed. For women, especially white women of the South, Margaret's specter carried particular resonance. She had defied expectations, not as heroine but as predator, wielding strength and cunning, where society insisted only weakness should reside. Some whispered of her in tones of horror, a cautionary tale of what became of women who strayed from their ordained place. Others, though fewer, and never aloud, wondered if her story revealed a darker truth, that the domestic sphere, so carefully guarded, was not shield against violence, but breeding ground for it. The same skills Margaret had used to tend hearth and family, she had redirected into cataloguing death, ordering trophies, crafting rituals of terror. What was supposed to be nurturing became dissecting. What was supposed to be pious became blasphemy. Her story blurred the boundary between household virtue and household cruelty, unsettling those who dared consider it fully. The church too wrestled with her shadow. Margaret's theology of blood and punishment had been perversion, but it was perversion drawn from familiar text. Ministers struggled to denounce her without acknowledging how easily scripture lent itself to her designs. They thundered that she had been deceived by Satan, that her use of psalms and verses was blasphemy. Yet in private, some admitted unease. Had not the very sermons they preached about obedience and punishment sown the soil for her violence? Was she truly aberration, or faithful follower, who had simply carried their doctrines to their logical monstrous? This question they dared not raise publicly, but it lingered nonetheless like smoke after fire. Margaret's house, abandoned after her death, became site of pilgrimage for the curious. Locals claimed her ghost still prowled the ruins, lantern in hand, searching for fugitives to drag back into darkness. Children dared one another to approach the cellar mound where her trophies had been buried, swearing that strange sounds rose from beneath the earth on stormy nights. In this way folklore preserved what history tried to erase. The widow became a specter of cautionary tales, her cruelty magnified into supernatural power. Even those who doubted the legends admitted unease in the woods, where every snapping branch seemed echo of her By the mid-19th century, Margaret Rainsford had become both forgotten and unforgettable, absent from archives yet alive in stories, absent from sermons yet present in nightmare. Her victims, once anonymous, remained largely nameless in public record, their bones unmarked beneath Virginia soil, yet in the whispered songs of their descendants, in the coded verses, sung on the long road north, their memory endured alongside her. One could not speak of the widow without, in some way, invoking those she had sought to erase. Thus her legacy was paradox. She silenced yet gave voice, she terrified yet instructed, she was buried, yet exhumed with every retelling. And perhaps this was the truest punishment, not the rope that broke her breath, not the stones that covered her cellar, but the endless circulation of her name, never stable, never at rest. Freeman, in his final account, wrote, "History will not record her, for history is written by those who require silence, but memory will keep her, for memory requires shadows. Let it be known, Margaret Rainsford lived, and what she lived was terror made flesh. If her story dies, it will not be because she lacked significance, but because significance itself was too dangerous to bear." By the year 1834, the earth had swallowed most physical trace of Margaret Rainsford. The timber house on the marsh collapsed inward, the cellar flooded, its stones sinking into mud until only a ridge of moss betrayed the outline of walls. Travelers passed without pausing, and when children asked about the ruin, their elders hushed them with a gesture. "Speak not of that place." Yet the silence was not absence, it was a silence burdened, dense as lead, the silence of communities that bury not only a body but also their complicity. The township of Harrogate recorded her neither in census nor in parish registry after 1803, as if she had never. Local annals list harvest yields, marriages and fires with meticulous care, but between 1800 and 1805 there is only a gap, as if the pen itself recoiled from writing what those years contained. For Dr. Elias Morton, who had once been confidant, the aftermath proved ruin. His own journals, when discovered among the effects of his grandson, revealed not only his horror, but also his hesitation. He had known enough to intervene, yet he had recoiled from action, soothed by her eloquence, fascinated by her conviction. His marginalia betray a man torn between professional duty and dread of exposure. To confess, he wrote in one entry, would be to confess myself complicit, for knowledge withheld is itself participation. That confession, never spoken aloud, haunted him until his death in 1819, when he was found collapsed at his writing desk, the last line in his ledger unfinished, her voice, still it. The county court, pressured by planters, sealed every scrap of testament. Proceedings were conducted behind locked doors, the transcripts burned. What fragments survived did so only through Nathaniel Freeman, the schoolmaster turned reluctant witness. His duplicates of the records, hidden in waxed bundles beneath floorboards, were recovered decades later, and now survive in part at a small archive in Massachusetts. Without them, Margaret's deeds might have dissolved entirely into ruin. Freeman's later writings reflect his bitterness at the suppression. In a letter dated 1827, he wrote, "What we feared most was not her cruelty, which ended with her body, but the recognition that she was not solitary in her doctrine. She was merely more honest. Others shared her belief that blood must be purified, that defect must be excised. They lacked only her courage or her madness to enact it. This perhaps is the truest horror of Margaret Rainsford, not that she existed, but that she embodied ideas latent in her society. Her fixation on hereditary weakness, her sermons on blood purity, her insistence that God sanctified suffering, these were not inventions of her mind alone.
They were reflections, amplified and twisted, of what she heard from pulpits and physicians alike. Where others mouthed the words abstractly, she took them literally. For those enslaved in Virginia, her name remained far more immediate. Oral histories recorded among freedmen after the Civil War preserve fragments of song and story. One account from Pennsylvania recalls a mother's warning, "Don't linger in the trees, child, or the widow will catch you by your breath." Another describes fugitives who refused to pass through Henrico County, even 30 years after Margaret's death, choosing longer and more dangerous routes rather than risk the haunted valley. In their telling, Margaret had become less a person than a presence, a figure of white terror inseparable from the landscape itself. Legends multiplied. Some said she still walked the marsh with her lantern. Others insisted her cellar remained intact, its trophies preserved in impossible stasis. Still others claimed her child survived, carrying forward her doctrines in secret. Each retelling blurred the line between fact and invention, yet each ensured her persistence. Even those who doubted admitted unease when traveling the old forest roads, where the fog still clung and the branches still creaked as if under invisible weight. By the late 19th century, antiquarians began to rediscover her story. Abolitionist tracts that had preserved fragments of Freeman's notes were reprinted for scholarly study. A handful of historians, poring over county land deeds, identified the Rainsford property. They found only bog and ruin, but their excavation turned up rusted shackles and fragments of bone too small to belong to livestock. These remains, though unproven, reignited whispers that the earth itself had not yet surrendered its dead. Modern physicians, looking back, sometimes attempt to name Margaret's mind hysteria, melancholia, monomania. Such diagnoses, however, grant little comfort. To reduce her to illness is to absolve the world that birthed her. It is easier to blame the defect of one woman than to reckon with the culture that furnished her theology of blood, sanctioned her cruelty through silence, and allowed her to hunt in plain sight. Even now, her story resists closure. Archivists speak of missing bundles of pages misplaced from Freeman's collection. Inquiries into local lore yield contradictory accounts. Some villagers insist her body was burned, others that it was buried at crossroads, others still that she was never executed at all, but disappeared into the fog one final night. Such contradictions are not errors, but symptoms of history's refusal to look her in the eye. And perhaps this is as it must be, for Margaret Rainsford was not merely a woman, nor merely a killer. She was the embodiment of a wound, one inflicted by a society upon itself. To name her precisely would be to heal too quickly, to declare the wound closed when it still bleeds. Thus she persists, in silence, in fragments, in songs half-remembered and pages half-burned. And if you walk the marshes near Harrogate on nights when the fog coils low and the branches shiver without wind, you may still glimpse a flicker of light moving steadily among the reeds. Some say it is only a lantern left by hunters, others that it is phosphorus rising from the swamp. But those who know the old stories will tell you otherwise. They will whisper that it is her, searching not for prey nor for vengeance, but for remembrance, lest we forget and in forgetting create her anew.